Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar with Finis Dunaway, author of the new book, Defending the Arctic Refuge. My name is Melanie Sturm. I'm the Forest and Wildlife Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kristen Jackson, our Digital Outreach Manager. NRCM is a nonprofit membership organization protecting, restoring, and conserving Maine's environment now and for future generations. We've been around for 62 years, and NRCM has been protecting the places and way of life that make Maine so special. NRCM harnesses the power of the law, science, and the voices of more than 25,000 members and supporters statewide and beyond to do our work. And our office is in Augusta, Maine, just steps away from the State House. One of NRCM's core values is land and wildlife conservation, which many of you probably know. So you might wonder, why are we talking about the Arctic today? And although most of our work centers on Maine, we sometimes put our efforts in protecting other places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that are of global significance. And in fact, we've advocated to protect the Arctic Refuge for over a decade when the issue has gained attention at the federal level. Before we get started with the program, a few notes about Zoom, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. But just so you know, this webinar is being recorded. And tomorrow you'll receive a follow-up email from us with a link to watch the recording and share that if you'd like. Your video and audio is disabled by design, so you will only be able to see and hear our presenters. If you have a question during the program, please type it into the Q&A box and we can get to those questions later on. There will be plenty of time for that. And now for the main event. Finis Dunaway is professor of history at Trent University, where he teaches US history, environmental studies, and media studies. He has written several books and contributed to scholarly journals, as well as popular media outlets. Finis is here to talk about his newly released book, Defending the Arctic Refuge, which tells the story of how activists, environmentalists, and Indigenous peoples in Alaska and Canada fought against the fossil fuel industry to protect the Arctic Refuge. Finis, thank you for being here. Please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie and Kristen, for inviting me to speak today. I'm in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, and I'm really excited to share with you this story of the history and ongoing struggle to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I've promised Melanie and Kristen that I would also include a few stories along the way about how the fight came to Maine, and in fact, how Maine became very pivotal to this struggle. So I want to begin by describing how I got interested in this topic and then tell you about the research journey that eventually led to this book. I'll just say from the outset that this is not the book that I set out to write. It emerged from years of research in libraries and archives and other places, but also from listening and learning, from talking with Indigenous leaders, scientists, environmental activists, and many others across the continent who've been involved in this struggle. So my interest in the Arctic Refuge was initially sparked by a photograph. I'll never forget the first time I saw it. It was the summer of 2005, and I was visiting family in Seattle, doing some research at the University of Washington. And one afternoon, as I was about to leave the library, this picture stopped me dead in my tracks. I'm sure it was the colors that first drew me in. You see the orange land and the luminescent waters that lead to the sky beyond. But then as I looked more closely, what really struck me were all those white birds. Those are flocks of snow geese that are coalescing as waves and undulations that are rippling, seeming to flow toward the horizon. This photograph appeared on a poster advertising a show about the Arctic Refuge. This is a faded version of the poster that now hangs on my office wall behind me. Titled Seasons of Life and Land, the exhibit featured photographs by someone I had never heard of before, Shubhankar Banerjee. So I rushed back to a library computer, I did a quick Google search, and learned that his photos had originally been exhibited 2 years earlier, 2003, at the Smithsonian, where they triggered a major controversy. This was during the George W. Bush administration, when there was an aggressive push to drill in the Arctic Refuge. So I went to the show across campus and found myself mesmerized by the images, including this one of pregnant caribou migrating over the frozen Colleen River, headed toward their calving grounds in the Arctic coastal plain. I was also interested in how Banerjee depicted the Arctic Refuge as interconnected with Indigenous communities, including in this photograph of Charlie Swaney taken at his hunting camp just outside of Arctic Village, Alaska. So I ended up going back to the show a couple more times before I left Seattle. And when I got home, I ended up writing a review essay about the exhibit. But at the time, I didn't think I would ever write about the Arctic again. I spent much of the next decade working on a book called Seeing Green, which looks at iconic images of environmentalism. But something led me back to the Arctic. When I finished writing this book, I started to read more about the refuge, and I found many things that surprised me. Now, before moving into the story of the book, I want to help get us oriented by showing a map. And this is a really unusual and important map, I think. It was created by the Gwitchin Steering Committee, a political advocacy group representing Gwitchin people in Alaska and Canada. Now, at first glance, this might look like any other map. There's a dotted line running through the middle that marks the international border between the US and Canada. But as I will explain, arbitrary political boundaries are in fact the least important feature of this map. So what you're looking at here is a portion of Alaska, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. And the gray shaded area on the Alaska side is the Arctic Refuge. The area was originally set aside in 1960 and then doubled in size 20 years later. But the 1980 law granted permanent wilderness status to much of the refuge, but not to the Arctic coastal plain. That's the area on the top right that's shaded red. Um, and if you look closely at the map, you will see that there's a darker line, a curvy line. This is one of the key features of the map. This shows you the range of the porcupine caribou herd. This herd currently numbers 200,000 caribou, and they migrate every year from the boreal forest in Alaska, in Canada, across the mountains and icy rivers to the Arctic coastal plain, which is where they have their young, the exact place where the oil industry has been trying to drill. It's not just caribou, though. Many other species rely on this area, including polar bears that have denning sites there. As well as approximately 200 species of birds that migrate from across the continent and around the world, including birds that migrate every year through Maine. In 2017, Susan Gallo, a wildlife biologist from Maine, noted that there were many species of shorebirds, including whimbrels and semi-palmated sandpipers, that breed in the Arctic Refuge and migrate through the coastal mudflats and beaches of Maine before continuing on their journey to South America. And other species, including the long-tailed duck and the American tree sparrow, nest in the Arctic and then spend the winter in Maine. And so in this way, you can see how the Arctic Refuge seems very far away from where many people in Maine and elsewhere live, but nevertheless is profoundly interconnected with the ecologies in which many of us live. So it's a biological nursery of national and global significance. Finally, this map, which as I said was created by the Gwitchin Steering Committee, demonstrates the striking overlap between the range of the porcupine herd, again, that's the darker curvy line you see there, and the homeland of the Gwitchin people, which is indicated by the lighter curvy line. And what's most interesting here is how these two lines repeatedly intersect. They almost mirror one another, showing the interconnections between indigenous communities and the caribou. So now that I've given you a brief overview of the region, I want to turn to the story of the book. So early in the research, I came across an article in Sierra Magazine. It was a brief profile of a man named Lenny Kohm, who was a photographer who traveled across the US presenting an Arctic slideshow. Intrigued by what I thought was an unusual story, I started writing Kohm a letter to see if I could interview him. This was in August of 2014. I put the note aside for a while to do a bit more research, and then I finally finished writing the letter in October 2014. Before hitting send, I Googled his name one more time just to see if I had the correct email address. And the first link to appear was his obituary. Lenny Kohm had died at his home in Todd, North Carolina on September 25th, 2014. He was 74 at the time. I was stunned to read this news. The next day, I ended up talking with a friend of his for almost an hour. And near the end of the conversation, he offhandedly said that he was giving the eulogy at Lenny's memorial on Saturday. And by the way, he said, if there's any way you can make it down, it would be wonderful to have you here. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if it would be appropriate for me to attend. He understood my concerns, but encouraged me to come anyway. He said the service was not going to be a somber occasion, but a celebration of Lenny's life. Just before saying goodbye, he insisted Lenny would want you to be there. So I decided to go to his memorial, held in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Many in attendance were from nearby communities like Boone, but others had come from elsewhere, including a representative of the Gwich'in Nation, all the way from Alaska. The room was decorated with some of Lenny's most treasured possessions, the two slide projectors that he carried with him as he crisscrossed the country, and also a beaded floral patterned caribou skin vest given to him by Indigenous people from the North. Speaking on behalf of the Gwich'in Nation, Lucy Beach said that all of our hearts are heavy for our brother, our uncle, our grandpa. She talked about the deep connection Lenny formed with Gwitchin communities and praised his photographs of her people. He saw us as part of the landscape, she explained. He also knew how to listen, how to really, really listen. Beach was one of approximately 50 Gwitchin representatives who traveled with Lenny on slideshow tours, and she talked about her experiences on the road. He let us be our own spokespeople. He never told us what to say. And then she announced, if it wasn't for Lenny, I really think there would be drilling in the Arctic Refuge right now. At the potluck dinner that followed, several people repeated this claim to me. Lenny and his last great wilderness slideshow prevented oil drilling from happening in the refuge. Now, I must confess, I felt a little skeptical. Surely they were exaggerating. Yeah, who among us has not engaged in hyperbole at a funeral? Still, the questions gnawed at me. Could Lenny's low budget tours really have made that much of a difference in such a high profile environmental debate? Could a traveling slideshow have protected the Arctic Refuge? When I left the memorial, I had no idea I would spend the next 5 years chasing down sources and talking with people across the continent about his activism. For reasons I cannot fully explain, I found myself becoming fascinated and ultimately obsessed with this story. It all happened gradually. I started going to libraries and archives like a good historian, where I'd pour through boxes and files, looking for any materials I could find about the Arctic Refuge campaign. And whenever I stumbled across a stray document that referenced the last Great Wilderness Show, I could feel my heart rate quicken. The paper trail was elusive. There were a few letters there, as you can see here, some tour itineraries that I could find, and I would spend hours that sometimes turned into days in the offices and storage rooms of environmental and Indigenous organizations. I went to the homes of activists where I looked through files and boxes tucked away in people's garages and basements. I combed through newspapers, especially smaller market, local papers, to gather coverage of last Great Wilderness shows. I spoke with Gwitchin representatives who went on slideshow tours, with grassroots organizers who helped plan and promote the show in their communities, and with lobbyists and staff members of DC-based environmental groups who help coordinate these tours. I was searching for any clues that could help me understand the strange career of Lenny Kohm. For a year, I tried to track down a physical copy of the last Great Wilderness Show. And I have to say, I began to despair that I was never going to find the show. Lenny's massive collection of slides was being kept at a friend's house outside of Boone. But no one knew whether the original show, which was not only slides, but also included a soundtrack with music and narration, was still intact and available anywhere. The next summer, I went to Fairbanks, Alaska, to the office of the Northern Alaska Environmental Center. And on the far corner of a bookshelf, I spotted a large binder labeled LGW Slideshow. I opened it up and found that it was filled with plastic storage sheets containing slides from the show. The Northern Center, I learned, had sponsored many activists on slideshow tours over the years, using a duplicate copy of The Last Great Wilderness. I also learned that a local volunteer was planning, at some point, to digitize the slides. But several of the slides were missing, and it was unclear whether anyone in Fairbanks had a copy of the show's music and narration. Then when I turned to the final sheet in the binder, I found a slide listing the show's credits. I put it on a light box and I took note of the name Richard Dale, who was credited with producing the soundtrack. When I contacted him, I was ecstatic to learn not only that he had another copy of the slides in Sonoma, California, only 3 sets of the Last Great Wilderness show were ever produced, but also that he had digitized the full show, including the soundtrack. When I visited him in California a few months later, he gave me a digital copy of the show I'd been searching for. I'm going to show you a couple clips of this show later. So as I began to piece together this story, I came to see the slideshow, a source that could easily be lost to history, as a remarkable experiment in citizen democracy and grassroots activism. We often think about images as having the most power when they're seen by the most people. Think about singular iconic photos. Dorothea Lange's picture from the Great Depression titled Migrant Mother, or NASA's image of the blue marble of the Earth taken from outer space. These are celebrated for their capacity to crystallize a cultural moment, shape public consciousness, even alter the course of history. In contrast to these famous images, Lenny's photographs never became iconic. So this story invites us to consider the impact of images that did not circulate in the mass media, but rather were shared in such unassuming venues like university lecture halls, public libraries, and church basements. So who was Lenny Kohm? Here he is with his red long johns in the Arctic and floppy blue hat. He was an unlikely activist. He graduated from the Berklee College of Music and pursued a career as a jazz drummer for about 15 years. In 1977, he decided that he was probably, and this is a quote, the 238th best drummer in the world. You have to love that tongue-in-cheek quantitative precision. He decided to abandon his percussion career and he moved to Sonoma, California. He walked into a drugstore and, in his words, conned my way into running the photo department. So Lenny was the guy who would develop film that customers would drop off. And he said from doing that, he learned about photography just in dealing with people and their snapshots. He soon took up photography himself and began dabbling in art photography and photojournalism. In 1987, as the Reagan administration pushed to develop the refuge, Lenny journeyed north, and this was a speculative assignment for Audubon magazine. He was hoping to sell pictures to the magazine. He visited Arctic Refuge as well as 2 Gwitchin communities, and this is particularly important to the story. He went to Arctic Village, Alaska, and across the border to Old Crow, Yukon. And from the Gwitchin, he gained an entirely different perspective on this issue. He learned that the drilling plan represented a form of colonial violence that threatened their culture and the caribou that migrate through their lands. So it was not simply a question of wilderness versus oil. He learned that the place where the caribou give birth was the exact place the fossil fuel industry wanted to drill, and that this would jeopardize the culture, the identity, the food security of indigenous peoples on both sides of the US-Canada border. He returned to California and he immediately threw himself into anti-drilling activism. Along with some friends, he formed a group called the Sonoma Coalition for the Arctic Refuge. And this began as a very modest effort, a local grassroots campaign to convince their member of Congress to vote against drilling. From there, it evolved into the last great wilderness project, a multimedia slideshow that was their main outreach tour. In my research, I came across a phrase that I think really encapsulates the political vision underlying these slideshow tours: the trickle up theory of politics. So according to this idea, and this is a phrase used by Lenny and other activists, they sought to bring local grassroots attention to the Arctic Refuge in communities all across the US. And in turn, they believed that local media coverage and citizen concern would trickle up to national media outlets and to policymakers in DC. So they're trying to influence federal policy, but they believe the true source of power resided outside the Beltway. And I think the trickle up theory really captures the approach taken by the Sonoma Coalition. As I said, it began as an effort to influence their member of Congress, but eventually turned into something much more. The coalition also reframed the Arctic Refuge. They connected this area of northeastern Alaska to the cultural survival and food security of Indigenous peoples. And until the Sonoma Coalition came along, national environmental groups rarely emphasized the human rights issues at stake. They tended to paint the issue as one of wilderness versus oil. The Sonoma Coalition, working in conjunction with the Gwitchin, changed the narrative. And they also began partnering with the Gwitchin, something, a legacy that has continued to this day in terms of environmental Indigenous alliances. So in May of 1988, Lenny came back to the north for a second trip, maybe wearing his red long johns again, spending 4 months in Gwitchin communities in Alaska, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. He was there to take photos for the show, but also to learn from the Gwitchin about their lives on the land. He wanted to connect with the Indigenous peoples and grasp our stories, recalled Norma Cassie, who's a leader of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation in the Yukon. He went right directly to our camps and lived with us on the land and ate caribou with us and helped us make dry meat. He wanted to feel that. He embraced our Indigenous knowledge as much as he could. So by the time Kohm returned to Old Crow in May 1988, he had built trust and understanding with community members. They viewed him as an ally. They believed his photographs would aid in their struggle to protect the caribou calving grounds. He began his 4-month journey through Gwitchin country in Crow Flats, which is a vast wetland complex north of Old Crow. And he stayed with Norma Cassie and her family at their hunting camp. He took tons of pictures while he was there, including this one of a snow-covered mountain across Zelma Lake, glimmering in the pale light. He photographed caribou crossing in groups over the still frozen lake. And he photographed the campsite itself. You can see there the large canvas wall tent where Norma and her family slept, and the smaller recreational tent he pitched nearby. These experiences with Norma's family and other Gwitchin allowed Lenny to glimpse local realities and see firsthand how their lives, their culture, their food security were all tied to the transboundary caribou herd. While he was in Crow Flats with Norma's family, her mother started calling him in Gwitchin the little white man who never sleeps. This seemed to be an apt description, as he always seemed to be roaming around, relishing the long hours of sunlight, taking rolls and rolls of pictures. As he wandered around in the bush, Norma's mom teased him. "Bear might kill you." She used to talk to him like that, Norma told me. And he'd look at me funny and we'd burst out laughing. Finally, I told her in Gwitchin, we need those pictures because we're going to show it to everybody outside in the world. So these photographs and the slideshow were made with the cooperation of Indigenous communities, and they played an active role in helping the Gwitchin fight for a future of their own. So when Lenny returned after spending 4 months up north to California, he and other Sonoma Coalition members put together the slideshow. They began by gathering pictures taken by many different photographers, a few thousand in all, which they winnowed down to about 250 images, including several by Wilbur Mills, who had visited Arctic Alaska in the 60s and 70s, a photograph taken by Fran Maurer of an incredible aggregation of caribou, as well as shots of the Prudhoe Bay oil fields by Pamela A. Miller to show what could happen if drilling ever occurred in the refuge. And of course, they included many photographs of Lennies taken in Gwitchin country. Sonoma Coalition members adopted what they considered cutting-edge technology. Remember, this is 1988. They took 2 slide projectors along with something called a fade dissolve unit. And this fade dissolve unit was cued to the soundtrack. So that would mean that viewers would see one slide gradually fade out as the slide from the other projector gradually fades in. So as you watch the show, there are these moments where you sort of have these 2 images like sort of superimposed on one another, which creates this really interesting kind of visual mysteries as you watch it. The show runs for about 30 minutes, and it opens with complete blackness. I'm going to play the first bit of the show just to give you a sense of the style and the feel of it. So don't be alarmed. The first 37 seconds, all you're going to see is blackness, and you're going to hear a song performed by Richard Dale from the Sonoma Coalition, who did the soundtrack. The long period of darkness makes the show feel like the beginning of the world, and then we see the images of the Arctic Refuge.
But if I close my eyes, I can ride the winds. I can coast the earth, rest ashore, and rise again. But I won't close my eyes till it's time, my friend, till your weary smile starts to light, so light begins.
So after this opening scene, the show layers many different issues. It emphasizes wilderness and wildlife protection. It discusses fossil fuel dependency, global warming, and the need to transition to a more sustainable energy system. And then it shifts to Gwitchin country to present the refuge struggle as a fight for Indigenous rights and environmental justice. So I want to show you another clip now. I meant to say this before. I know many of us are watching this on a small screen, but try to imagine yourself at a church basement or a lecture hall or a library where there would be a big screen that you would be in which you would be viewing the show. So this clip comes from the Gwitchin segment of the show. These are all photographs taken by Lenny. And what you're going to do is hear him interviewing Randall and Mabel Tetlichi in their cabin in Old Crow.
It seems to me that the time has come to listen to the wisdom of these people who have been stewards of the land for thousands of years.
Lenny, we want to be heard. We want the whole world to know we do exist.
What would you tell them?
I'll tell them we live north of the Arctic Circle, and we've been living off the land for centuries, and that we depend on the porcupine caribou herd every day of our lives. I mean, I did since I was born, and my grandparents and grandparents, only God knows how many grandparents before me depend on it. And now I want to see my grandchildren depend on it. I mean, we make use of everything on the caribou, right from the hoofs right to the horn. We make games out of it, we make different medicine out of it, we eat it, we make clothes with it, we make tools with it. You know, that's our survival. If there's no caribou, we're gonna have a hard time again. And I hope people from the south listen to us and try to get the picture that we talk about. Well, the Creator made the land for everybody, all the races. And what Native people do is try to respect that, try to respect the Creator. And a lot of old people say, well, material things won't help you. The spiritual side of life, and learning how to be kind and having respect and patience and good reason for all your movements without hurting anybody is very important.
Me as an individual, I have respect for the land as a Native person. I have respect for everywhere I go. We're just people that live off the land. And we could teach people lots. I feel we could teach people lots.
It seems to me.
Apologize. So one of the great things about that clip is, first of all, Randall's words, I hope people from the South listen to us. That became a really crucial part of this campaign. And then, you can really feel the realness of it, the authenticity of the conversation. You even hear that hinge of the door closing at one point. So this doesn't come across as like an overly slick form of propaganda. This is a really, human, very real, authentic conversation happening. The show ends with a photograph of two pairs of boys, their arms draped around one another, beaming with irreplaceable glee as they run along a road in Old Crow. It dissolves into the show's final slide, and here you get that sense of the overlap between the images through the fade dissolve unit. Two clusters of bulls walking with apparent purpose over the frozen ground. So these slides fuse the human story with the caribou story, the fate of the Gwitchin with the fate of the Arctic Refuge. For Gwitchin spokespeople, some of Lenny's photographs held profound personal meaning, especially when they saw their loved ones in the pictures. Lorraine Nitro described to me what she remembers when she saw this photograph. It was 1999, the first time I ever gave a talk with Lenny, she said. There were 300 to 500 people there, and I did not know what to expect. I was trying to be brave and strong and thinking in my head, how was I going to go about it? Then she said, I saw a picture of my son and his friends. They were happy and they had their arms around each other. They had teeth missing and were just smiling. By the time it was my time to speak, I just felt there was a reason I was there. One day, she said to the audience, I hope to be blessed with grandchildren. I'm doing this because it's my responsibility that they can continue to have our way of life. The very way of life for my people is in your hands, in your decision makers' hands. In the summer of 2016, I showed the Gwitchin segment of the show to Norma Cassie. She had not seen the slideshow in 20 years and was excited to look at the pictures again. As the images flashed across my laptop screen, she mentioned the names of people she recognized, including her sister. When I asked her what she thought of Lenny's photographs, it did not take her long to respond. It was, I think, for me, an intelligent approach to embrace how important the people were and how connected we were to the caribou. He was very much part of us, she said. He listened and he engaged in a very respectful way. Many photographers had visited Old Crow before, but Norma believed that Lenny's work was distinctive. That was the first betrayal of the Gwitchin, how intricate our way of life was and is as Arctic peoples. Many Gwitchin I interviewed emphasized how important Lenny was to building trust and alliances. Faith Gimmel, an Alaskan Gwitchin, recalled how she felt the first time she saw Lenny present the slideshow in Washington, D.C. When I first saw the show, I was crying. I was so homesick for my own people, just seeing them on the screen and hearing their voice. I started crying because I was so homesick, and he knew it. So he came up right up to me after, and we just hung out. And he just made me laugh, made me feel better, you know. He was like that. Not all the greenies were like Lenny, she said. He made me feel comfortable. He saw me as a human being, not as some exotic indigenous person from the north. He treated me like that. It made me comfortable right away. We were close from then on. On slideshow tours, Lenny liked to regale his Gwitchin companions with stories of other tour veterans. And several Gwitchin I interviewed all shared the same story with me about an elder traveling with Lenny Kohm through the state of Maine. Lenny had told the elder that there were lots of moose in the area. And so the elder said to him, "Really? I want to eat moose. Just drive to that house and they'll serve us moose." Faith explained to me the elder's perspective. In our village, you could go to anybody's house and they'll serve you our food. So the elder thought he could do that in Maine. And Lenny just started laughing. He's like, "I don't think they're going to have moose there." And he's like trying to explain to him that it's not like Gwitchin villages. You can't just go to anybody's house. See, Faith said, that's what Lenny did. He helped our people understand how the people there think and how they're different, and also made them understand how we think and how we're different. Lenny acted as a bridge between these different worlds. He'd just tell me these funny stories and make me laugh, she remembered. And it was what made us trust him, that he really did know our people. In our interview, Faith emphasized the challenges of alliance building, and she recalled advice a Gwitchin elder gave to her. Speaking about environmentalists, he said, "We'll work with them, we'll have respect for each other, but in the ultimate end, we might end up standing alone." So always remember that, she said, because they're not invested. They don't live here. It's not their children that will be impacted. So for them, they could walk away tomorrow and jump on some other issue and leave us hanging. Faith said that Lenny was one of the key environmentalists who helped build strong ties with the Gwitchin. And that's why people like Lenny were important, because they were like a linchpin. They kept us connected. Faith also wanted me to appreciate the diversity of Gwitchin who went on the road with Lenny. He traveled with elders. He traveled with youth. He traveled with women, she said. We have to trust whoever is with them that they're going to take good care of them. We sent cherished elders, cherished young people to him from our villages because we trusted him. In the early years, Lenny drove his metallic green Chevy Malibu Classic around the country with bumper stickers that announced the show's purpose: help preserve the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, America's last great wilderness. And he filled the back seat with everything he needed for the show. He had these custom built wooden crates that he would put the projectors and the sound system and the speakers and the cables and the wires and the cords all so they could fit in his car. And on one of the crates, there were these wheels so that he could stack the boxes on top of one another and roll everything to the next show. Over the years, Lenny would partner with national environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the Alaska Wilderness League, and with Indigenous governments and Indigenous-led organizations, including the Gwitchin Steering Committee. And he relied on the support of grassroots activists across the continent who would help plan and promote their show in their communities. For example, he came through Maine many times over the years and was aided by volunteers like Jack Biscoe, who was a retired high school principal who became involved in the Arctic Refuge fight following the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. Biscoe became Lenny's primary contact in Maine, planning tours through the state and working to put the trickle up theory into practice to encourage congressional members from the state to vote against oil drilling. In the book, I describe many tense moments over the decades in which it seemed that the outcome could go either way, in which it seemed that oil drilling proponents might finally win. And so much of the narrative hinges on these moments, on the relatively narrow time scale of recent political history. But I also try to infuse the book with some longer term perspective. As an outsider, I'll never understand the depth of feeling and concern that Gwitchin bring to the Arctic Refuge fight, the relations of responsibility that they have maintained with the caribou since time immemorial. Shirley Frost, a citizen of the Gwich'in First Nation who toured with Lenny, explained to me that whenever she spoke about the refuge, she tried to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for young people, for future generations, for non-human beings. What gave her strength, she said, was knowing that there were thousands of years of ancestors sitting behind me and speaking through me. She was addressing and inhabiting the present moment, but that moment contained multitudes of time, the countless generations behind her, the future generations before her, and the generations of caribou and other life forms that depend on Arctic ecosystems. All of these timescales were collapsed and compressed into her words and in the collective Gwitchin effort to maintain their pact with the caribou, to keep alive these relations of responsibility that run the full sweep of Gwitchin time. As I pieced together the story of the slideshow, then, I found that it offered a portal into much larger, broader themes. So in the book, I've woven histories of Indigenous resistance to colonial mega projects in Alaska and northwestern Canada, of the government suppression of science, of changing political dynamics in DC, and the role of the Gwitchin Steering Committee in building alliances with diverse groups, including churches and faith communities. And I also profile other photographers and filmmakers who used images as tools for public outreach, including Shubhankar Banerjee, with which I began this talk. During the George W. Bush years, Shubhankar adopted Lenny's model of activism, doing slideshow tours, often with Indigenous spokespeople. In 2005, he came to Portland, Maine, where one member of the audience, Reverend David Heald of the St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church in Yarmouth, was so moved by the presentation that he devoted an entire Sunday sermon to the Arctic Refuge. Call it a geography of prayer and contemplation, he said to worshipers, of wonder and awe, of humble reverence in the face of the sublime, like the vast open spaces of the Arctic tundra where the snow geese fly free. During those years, Maine proved critical to the Arctic fight, as the state's two Republican senators, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, listened to their constituents and repeatedly voted against Arctic drilling. And Maine may prove critical again this year as part of a larger effort to get Congress to finally grant permanent protection to the Arctic coastal plain. I'm going to move toward my conclusion now, and I just want to go back to Lenny's memorial. Since attending that memorial in 2014, I've interviewed many people who've stated without any doubt or hesitation that his slideshow protected the Arctic Refuge. Joe Tetlici, a Gwitchin representative from Canada who joined Lenny on 2 tours, said to me, if it wasn't for him, there would be oil development on the Arctic Refuge right now. You think so, I asked. Oh yeah, he immediately responded. I don't think so. I know so. Look at the near close calls we had. Imagine if Lenny never went up for the job. What could have happened? Brian O'Donnell, who served as executive director of the Alaska Wilderness League for several years, said that Lenny's project kept the Arctic Refuge from being destroyed. Absolutely. Now, it'd be easy to dismiss these comments as naive statements about the power of images and one person to influence environmental policy. But I don't think they're claiming that the slideshow had some kind of simple, direct, or immediate effect on politics. Beyond the sheer number of constituent letters and phone calls generated by the tours, this project created a set of relationships reaching from Capitol Hill to north of the Arctic Circle to cities and towns across the lower 48. And it's those relationships that allow the slideshow to have agency and impact in the world. As Brian said, how did the Arctic Refuge go from being a wildlife refuge to being an iconic place that was the biggest environmental fight in the US for decades? It's never that one meeting in a garden club in Toledo, Ohio, but maybe it's the 1,000 meetings and the 1,000 Toledos around the country. And you can never know which one did it or how all this happened. But I can tell you it wouldn't have happened after Lenny, without Lenny. And as Joe and others emphasized, Lenny played a crucial role in forming relationships, building trust and alliances between Gwitchin communities and environmental organizations. Imagine if Lenny never went up for the job, Joe asked, what could have happened? His use of counterfactuals suggests that at various moments, different outcomes could have occurred. I first met Joe in the summer of 2016, the 8th year of Barack Obama's presidency. The refuge had been in political dormancy for a decade, but a few months after we talked, Donald Trump was elected president. Spewing climate change denial, his administration immediately launched an all-out assault on environmental regulation, pushing for reckless expansion of fossil fuel development. And it took little time for drilling proponents to sneak an Arctic drilling provision into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was passed by Congress and signed by Trump on December 22nd that year. This was the first time that both Congress and the president had approved a drilling plan. With the refuge under greater threat than ever before, this history has a new urgency and relevance for our time. The stories I've told here don't offer a blueprint to follow today. It's hard to imagine someone loading up a car with slide projectors, but they demonstrate how visual images, along with testimony from people in frontline communities, can help organize and mobilize at the grassroots. They show how respectful relationships can be built between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and they indicate the urgency of struggling before it is too late to defend the Arctic Refuge. So what I've tried to share with you today and in this book is a history of contingency, a story of things that could have turned out differently, a history that was forged not only in the hard marble hallways of Capitol Hill, but also a history made by a rambling activist and Gwitchin spokespeople and local organizers, a history enacted in lecture halls, church basements, public libraries, and today via Zoom. It's a story of the grassroots taking on Goliath, of a slideshow galvanizing the citizenry, and of unlikely cross-cultural alliances forming across vast distances. I wrote this history during an urgent time, and I tried to infuse it with the hope that things might still turn out differently. Thank you very much for your attention. And now Kristen will share with you how you can play a role in this fight today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Finis, for sharing that story of Lenny and how activism played such a critical role in protecting the Arctic Refuge. But as you mentioned, we know that there is more that needs to be done in order to permanently protect the Arctic Refuge. So I'm going to take a moment to encourage you all to participate in this movement, and then we will have some time for question and answer for Finis. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the question and answer box down at the bottom of your screen and type them in, and we'll get to those in a second. But as we heard from both Finis and Melanie, the Arctic Refuge is a place of national, ecological, and cultural significance and deserves to be protected. We know that oil and gas drilling threatens the livelihood of the Gwitchin people and destroys habitat for caribou and migratory birds and polar bears and other wildlife. But we also know that drilling doesn't make financial sense either. So this past January, when the federal government asked for bids on parcels of land in the coastal plain for oil and gas leasing, no major companies participated. And that resulted in half of the leases receiving no bids at all. 9 of the 11 leases ended up being purchased by the state of Alaska for a fraction of the revenue that was predicted. So this just confirmed that most corporations think it's a bad idea to drill in the refuge too. But even though this lease sale was a flop, the refuge is still under threat until the leases are revoked and Congress finally grants permanent protection to the Arctic Refuge coastal plain. So we need to stop this oil and gas drilling, which is why we're calling on Congress for permanent protections against drilling in that region. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and I'll also be sending a follow-up email, and it's also on your screen that Melanie's showing right now. So you should have it in plenty of different ways. That will prompt you to send a message to Senators Collins and King, urging them to permanently protect the Arctic Refuge. We anticipate that there will be an opportunity for the Senate to take action on this issue within a couple of weeks. So we want to get those messages into their offices now. So please take a moment. That link will give you a sample message that you can either send as is, or you can tailor to add your own personal message to the senators. And you'll get to join this fight that Lenny and the Gwitchin people and so many people have been a part of for decades to protect this sacred region. So I'll let folks click that. And again, we'll be sending it out. And then also, before we get to question and answers, wanted to share some ways that you can purchase this book and read the full story yourself. So you can use this link that I'm dropping now to find the book near you, or you can purchase it online from UNC Press, and we have a discount code that you can use. And I'll drop that in here as well. So yes, please, if you want to read this full story and hear about the full fight to protect the Arctic and Lenny Kohm's traveling show, that's a great way to do it. So I think now we will turn to a few questions and answers for Finis. Let's start with having you tell us a little bit more about why the Gwitchin joined the Arctic Refuge fight and what impact their leadership and advocacy had on the struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that is an important theme throughout the book, that the Gwitchin have been fighting to protect this place for decades, and they didn't do it. They didn't join the fight for the same reasons that many environmentalists did. For them, this was not some distant, faraway place, but instead their backyard, their homelands. And so for them, this is a way to maintain the relations with caribou that they've had for thousands and thousands of years. And they always made it clear that they were partnering with the environmentalists, but they were doing so on their own terms and for their own reasons. For a long time, they did this behind the scenes, even going back to some of the legislation that created the Arctic Refuge in 1980. The Gwitchin were playing a role then to not allow oil drilling. But after 1988 is when they take on a much more public role in this fight. There's a major event that's held in the summer of '88. The first Gwitchin gathering in over 100 years took place in Arctic Village, Alaska. And Lenny was actually one of the small number of non-Indigenous people to attend that gathering. He took photos of the gathering, included in the show. But it's at that point that the Gwitchin decided to share their story with the world and to ally in a very formal public way with environmental groups in DC and elsewhere, but to make it clear that they were doing so for their own reasons and they were always going to be their own spokespeople. One of the major contributions I'd say they made was particularly to help bring in support from people who may not identify as environmentalists, as card-carrying members of environmental groups. I think the Gwitchin helped many people understand how this was not just an environmental issue, but a human rights issue. And that brought in support from all kinds of diverse groups, including, as I mentioned briefly, churches and faith communities that became very involved because of the Gwitchin leadership on the issue. And that happened from the late 80s on, beginning with the Episcopal Church, and then all kinds of other religious groups have been involved and are still involved to this day.
Great. In your talk, you also mentioned how people at Lenny's memorial claimed that his slideshow, The Last Great Wilderness, kept oil drills out of the Arctic Refuge. Is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, you really put me on the spot with that one. And what I tried to do I'll try to weasel my way out of this. What I tried to do in the book is give enough evidence to suggest that that's the case without coming out and saying it directly. I kind of rather the reader sort of decide what they think. But if I were pushed on it, I would say yes. I think it did. But I wanted to leave some room for people to come to their own conclusion. And this became clear to me from in a couple different ways. One was talking to people who were lobbyists environmental lobbyists in DC during some of the years of close votes, and they emphasizing how much people at the grassroots level were having an impact upon senators and members of Congress through letters and phone calls, and other kinds of action, that really made a decisive difference in bringing people who were like, on the fence on the issue over to the side of protection, and looking at like local newspapers, seeing how local newspapers coverage of the shows, letters to the editors, and how that, in places like Chattanooga, Tennessee, led to a senator from Tennessee eventually switching his vote from pro-drilling to anti-drilling. And that all happened as a result of grassroots involvement, which the slideshow was a critical part of. So ultimately, I became more and more convinced by what seemed to me like a kind of outlandish claim made his memorial in 2014, that yes, this slideshow, because of the relationships it built and because it encouraged people to be involved in a very active way over a long period of time, and that's the story of this fight, is that it's something that's taken place over decades. So yes, I think that it's not the only factor, but I think it played an outsized role for a low budget slideshow created by amateur activists in Sonoma, California in 1988. It played a huge role for decades. Lenny actually kept touring all the way up through the W years, and his last show was in 2008. So for about 20 years, he was doing this. And it created a model, I should say, it also created a model that others followed, like Shubhankar Banerjee and others.
That's great. And a follow-up we got from the audience is, will you work to become the new Lenny Kohm? And if so, how can we help to amplify your message?
I think that question may have come from my father-in-law, and I'll go ahead and give credit to his wife, my mother-in-law, who mentioned to me Shubhankar Banerjee's show in Seattle when we were visiting back in 2005, and was before I even saw the photograph. I was at least heard of this of this show that was happening, but it was the photograph that have convinced me to go. I don't think I have what it takes to be the new Lenny Kohm. However, I appreciate the suggestion. What's funny, or sort of surprising to me about this, is that I've now sort of given a lot of talks virtually, and they're in the same venues, even in a virtual space that Lenny operated in. So I've done a few for environmental groups, one for a religious group, one for a library, one for a museum. This is the first one, though, that's actually directed toward a particular action, because now we have a clearer sense of what's happening on Capitol Hill in terms of budget reconciliation package and the like. And so I do feel that maybe Lenny's spirit is here in that way, and that this is not just about awareness, but also calling for involvement and action. But no, I can't say I'm going to take on that mantle, but I will do whatever I can to help the book and the story of Lenny have a life, in the world, not just be, history, but something that hopefully can make a small difference in the fight today.
We have a great start with all of these talks that you're doing. I just want to point to the chat that Melanie just put in the chat box. If you are in Southern Maine, Print Bookstore in Portland has copies of the book. And just did want to make sure that we mention all royalties from the book go to the Gwitchin Steering Committee, so you can help to benefit that cause as well. I think given the time, we'll wrap up with one last quick question, which is, if folks want to view the whole Last Great Wilderness slideshow, is there a place that they can do that?
Yeah, well, what's great, because of Richard Dale from Sonoma having digitized the show, I've now been able to put this on a website, which is a website companion to the book. And I think you may have put that link up there, defendingthearcticrefuge.com. Right now, that's the main thing you'll find on the website. My plan is over the next few weeks to add a historical timeline and other sources, something that could be useful to people who are, students or educators or activists or journalists, to sort of give an overview of the entire Arctic Refuge fight and share sources and materials related to that history of this issue. But for now, what you can see is the full slideshow digitized with the soundtrack and everything else. So you can sit back and watch the entire 30 minutes of the show. And I think what you'll find, if I haven't given too much away already, is that it's not only, I think aesthetically really interesting because of the ways in which they weave together personal stories and images and music, But also for 1988, this was really cutting edge environmentalism by foregrounding the Indigenous rights issue, something that environmental groups had not done before, by talking about global warming, as the term was usually used then, which this is before Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, came out, the first popular book on global warming, and really connecting the refuge to questions of fossil fuel use and the need to transition to a different system. It's very innovative for his time, and I think it holds up remarkably well, more than 30 years later. So I would encourage folks to check out the website and watch the show.
Great. Yeah, and I just put that in the chat again in case
Oh.
folks needed it. Well, that is all of our time today. Thank you so much, Finis. Thank you everyone for attending. We'll be sending up a follow-up email with all of these links as well, and we hope to see you at another NRCM event soon.